Having now, as far as it could be done in such a cursory manner, analyzed the nature of the value of any commodity whatever, we must turn our attention to the specific value of labor. And here again I must startle you by a seeming paradox. All of you feel sure that what they sell is their labor. That is, therefore, labor has a price, and that the price of a commodity, being only the monetary expression of its value, there must certainly exist such a thing as the value of labor. However, there exists no such thing as the value of labor in the common acceptance of the word. We have seen that the amount of necessary labor crystallized in a commodity constitutes its value. Now, applying this notion of value, how could we define, say, the value of a 10-hour working day? How much labor is contained in that day? 10 hours labor. To say that the value of 10 hours working day is equal to 10 hours labor, or the quantity of labor contained in it, would be a tautological and moreover a nonsensical expression. Of course, having once found out the true but hidden sense of the expression, quote, value of labor, unquote, we shall be able to interpret this irrational and seemingly impossible application of value in the same way that, having once made sure of the real movement of the celestial bodies, we shall be able to explain their apparent or merely phenomenal movements. What the working man sells is not directly his labor, but his laboring power, the temporary disposal of which he makes over to the capitalist. This is so much the case that I do not know whether English laws, but certainly by some continental laws, the maximum time is fixed for which a man is allowed to sell his laboring power. If allowed to do so for any indefinite period, whatever, slavery would be immediately restored. Such a sale, if it comprised his lifetime, for example, would make him at once the lifelong slave of his employer. One of the oldest economists and most original philosophers of England, Thomas Hobbes, has already in his Leviathan instinctively hit upon the point overlooked by all of his successors. He says, quote, "The value or worth of a man is, as in all other things, his price. That is, so much as would be given for the use of his power. Proceeding from this basis, we shall be able to determine the value of labor as that of all other commodities." But before doing so, we might ask how this strange phenomenon arise that we find on the market a set of buyers possessed of land, machinery, raw material, and the means of subsistence, all of them save land in its crude state, products of labor. On the other hand, a set of toilers, a set of sellers who have nothing to sell but their laboring power, their working arms and brains. That the one set buys continually in order to make a profit and enrich themselves, while the other set continually sells in order to earn their living. The inquiry into this question would be an inquiry into what economists call, quote, previous or original accumulation, but which ought to be called original expropriation. We should find that this so-called original accumulation means nothing but a series of historical processes resulting in a decomposition of the original union existing between the laboring man and his instruments of labor. Such an inquiry, however, lies beyond the pale of my present subject. The separation between the man of labor and the instruments of labor, once established, such a state of things will maintain itself and reproduce itself upon a constantly increasing scale until a new and fundamental revolution in the mode of production should again overturn it and restore the original union in a new historical form. What then is the value of laboring power? Like every other commodity, its value is determined by the quantity of labor necessary to produce it. The laboring power of a man exists only in his living individuality. A certain mass of necessaries must be consumed by a man to grow up and maintain his life. But the man, like the machine, will wear out and must be replaced by another man. Beside the mass of necessaries required for his own maintenance, he wants another amount of necessaries to bring up a certain quota of children that are to replace him on the labor market and to perpetuate the race of laborers. Moreover, to develop his laboring power and acquire a given skill, another amount of values must be spent. For our purposes, it suffices to consider only average labor, the costs of whose education and development are vanishing magnitudes. Still, I must seize upon this occasion to state, as the costs of producing laboring powers of different quality differ, so much differ the values of laboring powers employed in different trades. The cry for an equality of wages rests thereupon upon a mistake. It is an inane wish never to be fulfilled. It is an offspring of that false and superficial radicalism that accepts premises and tries to evade conclusions. Upon the basis of the wages system, the value of laboring power is settled like that of every other commodity. And as different kinds of laboring power have different values or require different quantities of labor for their production, they must fetch different prices in the labor market. To clamor for an equal or even equitable retribution on the basis of the wages system is the same as to clamor for freedom on the basis of the slavery system. What you think just or equitable is out of the question. The question is, what is necessary and unavoidable with a given system of production? And what has been said, after what has been said, it will be seen that the value of laboring power is determined by the value of necessaries required to produce, develop, and maintain, and perpetuate the laboring. That the average amount of daily necessaries of a laboring man require 6 hours of average labor for their production. Suppose, moreover, 6 hours of average labor to be realized in a quantity of gold equal to 3 shillings. Then 3 shillings would be the price or monetary expression of the daily value of that man's labor power. If he worked daily 6 hours, he would daily produce a value sufficient to buy the average amount of his daily necessaries, or to maintain himself as a laboring man. But our man is a wages laborer. He must therefore sell his laboring power to a capitalist. If he sells it at 3 shillings daily, or 18 shillings weekly, he sells it at its value. Suppose him to be a spinner. If he works 6 hours daily, he will add to the cotton a value of 3 shillings daily. This value, daily added by him, would be an exact equivalent for his wages, or the price of his laboring power, received daily. But in that case, no surplus value or surplus produce, whatever, would go to the capitalist. Here, then, we come to the rub. In buying the labor power of a workman and paying its value, the capitalist, like every other purchaser, has acquired the right to consume or use the commodity bought. You consume or use the laboring power of a man by making him work, as you consume or use a machine by making it run. By buying the daily or weekly value of the laboring power of the workman, the capitalist has, therefore, acquired the right to use or to make that laboring power during the whole day or week. The working day or the working week has, of course, certain limits, but those we shall afterwards look at more closely. For the present, I want to turn your attention to one decisive point. The value of laboring power is determined by the quantity of labor necessary to maintain or reproduce it. But the use of that laboring power is only limited by the active energies and physical strength of the laborer. The daily or weekly value of laboring power is quite distinct from the daily or weekly exercise of that power. The same as the food a horse wants and the time it can carry the horseman are quite distinct. The quantity of labor by which the value of the workman's laboring power is limited forms by no means a limit to the quantity of labor which his laboring power is apt to perform. Take the example of our spinner. We have seen that to daily reproduce his laboring power, he must daily reproduce a value of 3 shillings, which he will do by working 6 hours daily. But this does not disable him from working 10 or 12 or more hours a day. But by paying the daily or weekly value of the spinner's laboring power, the capitalist has acquired the right of using that labor power during the whole day or week. He will therefore make him work, say, daily 12 hours, over and above the 6 hours required to replace his wages or the value of his laboring power. He will therefore have to work 6 other hours, which I shall call hours of surplus labor, which surplus labor will realize itself in surplus value and a surplus produce. If our spinner, for example, by his daily labor of 6 hours added 3 shillings to the value of cotton, a value forming an exact equivalent to his wages, he will in 12 hours add 6 shillings worth to the cotton and produce a proportional surplus of yarn. As he has sold his laboring power to the capitalist, the whole value of produce created by him belongs to the capitalist, the owner pro tem of his laboring power. By advancing 3 shillings, the capitalist will therefore realize a value of 6 shillings, because advancing a value in which 6 hours of labor are crystallized, he will receive in return a value in which 12 hours of labor are crystallized. By repeating this same process daily, the capitalist will daily advance 3 shillings and daily pocket 6 shillings, 1/2 of which will go to pay wages anew, and the other half which will form surplus value, for which the capitalist pays no equivalent. It is this sort of exchange between capital and labor upon which capitalistic production, or the wages system, is founded, and which must constantly result in reproducing the working man as working man, and the capitalist as a capitalist. The rate of surplus value and all other circumstances remaining the same will depend on the portion between that part of the working day necessary to reproduce the value of laboring power and the surplus time or surplus labor performed for the capitalist. It will therefore depend on the ratio in which the working day is prolonged over and above that extent by which the working man would only reproduce the value of his laboring power, or let's now return to the expression value or price of labor. We have seen that in fact it is only the value of the laboring power measured by the values of commodities necessary for its maintenance. But since the workman receives his wages after his labor is performed, and knows moreover that what he actually gives to the capitalist is his labor, the value or price of his laboring power necessarily appears to him as the price or value of his labor itself. If the price of his laboring power is 3 shillings, in which 6 hours of labor are realized, and if he works 12 hours, he necessarily considers these 3 shillings as the value or price of 12 hours of labor, although these 12 hours of labor realize themselves in a value of 6 shillings. A double consequence flows from this. Firstly, the value or price of laboring power takes the semblance of a price or the value of labor itself, although strictly speaking, value and price are senseless terms. Secondly, although one part of the working man's daily labor is paid, while the other part is unpaid, and while that unpaid or surplus labor constitutes exactly the fund out of which surplus value or profit is formed, it seems, if the aggregate labor was paid labor. This false appearance distinguishes wages labor from other historical forms of labor. On the basis of the wages system, even the unpaid labor seems to be paid labor. With the slave, on the contrary, even that part of his labor which is paid appears to be unpaid. Of course, in order to work, a slave must live, and one part of his working day goes to replace the value of his own maintenance. But since no bargain is struck between him and his master, and no acts of selling or buying are going on between the two parties, all his labor seems to be given away for nothing. Take, on the other hand, the peasant serf, such as he, I might say until yesterday, existed in the whole of the east of Europe. This peasant worked, for example, 3 days for himself in his own field, or the field allotted to him, and 3 subsequent days he performed compulsory and gratuitous labor on the estate of his lord. Here, then, the paid and unpaid parts of labor were sensibly separated in time and space, and our liberals overflowed with moral indignation at the preposterous notion of making a man work for nothing. In point of fact, however, whether a man works 3 days of the week for himself on his own field, and 3 days for nothing on the estate of his lord, or whether he works in a factory or workshop for 6 hours daily for himself and 6 for his employer, comes to the same, although in the latter case the paid and unpaid portions of labor are inseparably mixed up with each other, and the nature of the whole transaction is completely masked by the intervention of a contract and the pay received at the end of the week. The gratuitous labor appears to be voluntarily given in the one instance and compulsory in the other. That makes all the difference. In using the word value of labor, I shall only use it as a popular slang for the term for valuing of labor power. Suppose an average hour of labor to be realized in a value equal to 6 pence, or 12 average hours of labor to be realized in 6 shillings. Suppose further the value of labor to be 3 shillings, or the produce of 6 hours labor. If then, in the raw material, machinery, and so forth, used up in the commodity, 24 hours of average labor were realized, its value would amount to 12 shillings. If, moreover, the workmen employed by the capitalist added 12 hours of labor to those means of production, these 12 hours would be realized in an additional value of 6 shillings. The total value of the product, therefore, amount to 36 hours of realized labor and be equal to 18 shillings. But as the value of labor, or wages paid to the workmen, would be 3 shillings only, no equivalent would have been paid by the capitalist for the 6 hours of surplus labor worked by the workmen and realized in the value of the commodity. By selling this commodity at its value for 18 shillings, the capitalist would therefore realize a value of 3 shillings for which he paid no equivalent. These 3 shillings would constitute the surplus value or profit pocketed by him. The capitalist would consequently realize the profit of 3 shillings not by selling the commodity at a price over and above its value, but by selling it at its real value. The value of the commodity is determined by the total quantity of labor contained in it. But part of that quantity of labor is realized in a value for which an equivalent has been paid in the form of wages. Part of it is realized in a value which no equivalent has been paid. Part of the labor contained in the commodity is paid labor, and part is unpaid labor. By selling, therefore, the commodity at its value, that is, as the crystallization of the total quantity of labor bestowed upon it, the capitalist must necessarily sell it at a profit. He sells not only what it has cost him an equivalent, but he sells also what has cost him nothing, although it has cost his workmen labor. The cost of the commodity to the capitalist and its real cost are different things. I repeat, therefore, that normal and average profits are made by selling commodities not above, but at their real value. The surplus value, or that part of the total value of the commodity in which the surplus labor, or unpaid labor, of the working man is realized, I call profit. The whole of that profit is not pocketed by the employing capitalist. The monopoly of land enables the landlord to take one part of that surplus value under the name of rent. Whether the land is used for agricultural buildings or railways or for any other productive purpose. On the other hand, the very fact that the possession of the instruments of labor enables the employing capitalist to produce a surplus value, or what comes to the same, appropriate to himself a certain amount of unpaid labor, enables the owner of the means of labor, which he lends wholly or partly to the employing capitalist, enables, in one word, the money-lending capitalist to claim for himself, under the name of interest, another part of that surplus value, so that there remains to the employing capitalist as such only what is called industrial or commercial profit. By what laws this division of the total amount of surplus value among the three categories of people is regulated is a question quite foreign to our subject. This much, however, results from what has been stated. Rent, interest, and industrial profit are only different names for different parts of the surplus value of the commodity, or the unpaid labor enclosed in it. And they are equally derived from this source and from this source alone. They are not derived from land as such or from capital as such, but land and capital enable their owners to get their respective shares out of the surplus value extracted by the employing capitalist from the laborer. For the laborer himself, it is a matter of subordinate importance whether that surplus value is the result of his surplus labor or unpaid labor, is altogether pocketed by the employing capitalist, or whether the latter is obliged to pay portions of it under the name of rent and interest away to third parties. Suppose the employing capitalist to use only his own capital and to be his own landlord. Then the whole of the surplus value would go into his pocket. It is the employing capitalist who immediately extracts from the laborer this surplus value, whatever part of it he may ultimately be able to keep for himself. Upon this relation, therefore, between the employing capitalist and the wages laborer, the whole wages system and the whole present system of production hinge. Some of the citizens who took part in our debate were there wrong in trying to mince matters and treat the fundamental relation between the employing capitalist and the working man as a secondary question, although they were right in stating that under given circumstances, a rise of prices might affect in very unequal degrees the employing capitalist, the landlord, the moneyed capitalist, and, if you please, the tax collector. Another consequence follows from what has been stated. That part of the value of the commodity which represents only the value of raw materials, the machinery, in one word, the value of the means of production used up, forms no revenue at all, but replaces only capital. But apart from this, it is false that the other part of the value of the commodity which forms revenue, or may be spent in the form of wages, profits, rent, interest, is constituted by the value of wages, the value of rent, the value of profits, and so forth. We shall in the first instance discard wages and only treat industrial profits, interests, and rent. We have just seen that the surplus value contained in the commodity, or that part of its value in which unpaid labor is realized, resolves itself into different fractions bearing three different names. But it would be quite the reverse of the truth to say that its value is composed of or formed by the addition of independent values to these three constituents. If 1 hour of labor realizes itself in a value of 6 pence, if the working day of the laborer comprises 12 hours, if half of this time is unpaid labor, the surplus labor will add to the commodity a surplus value of 3 shillings. That is, a value for which no equivalent has been paid. This surplus value of 3 shillings constitutes the whole fund which the employing class may divide in whatever proportions with the landlord and moneylender. The value of these 3 shillings constitutes the limit of the value they have to divide amongst them. But it is not the employing capitalist who adds the value of the commodity, an arbitrary value for his profit, to which another value is added for the landlord, and so forth, so that the addition of these arbitrarily fixed values would constitute the total value. You see, therefore, the fallacy of the popular notion, which confounds the decomposition of a given value into 3 parts, with the formation of that value by the addition of 3 independent values, thus converting the aggregate value from which rent, profit, and interest are derived into an arbitrary magnitude. If the total profit realized by the capitalist is equal to £100, we call this sum, considered an absolute magnitude, the amount of profit. But if we calculate the ratio which those £100 bear to the capital advanced, we call this relative magnitude the rate of profit. It is evident that this rate of profit may be expressed in a double way. Suppose £100 to be the capital advanced in wages. If the surplus value created is also £100, and this would show us that half of the working day of the laborer consists of unpaid labor, and if we measured this profit by the value of the capital advanced in wages, we should say that the rate of profit amounted to 100%, because the value advanced would be 100 and the value realized would be 200. On the other hand, we should not only consider the capital advanced in wages, but the total capital advanced. For example, £500, of which £400 represents the value of raw materials, machinery, and so forth. We should say that the rate of profit only amounted to 20%, because the profit of 100 would be but 1/5 of the total capital advanced. The first mode of expressing the rate of profit is the only one which shows you the real ratio between paid and unpaid labor. The real degree of the exploitation, you must allow me this French word, of labor. The other mode of expression is that in common use, and it is indeed appropriate for certain purposes. At all events, it is very useful for concealing the degree in which the capitalist extracts gratuitous labor from the workman. In the remarks I still have to make, I shall use the word profit for the whole amount of surplus value extracted by the capitalist, without regard to the division of that surplus value between different parties. And using the words rate of profit, I shall always measure profits by the value of the capital advanced from the value of the commodity, the value replacing the value of raw materials and other means of production used upon it. That is to say, deduct the value representing the past labor contained in it, and the remainder of its value will resolve into the quantity of labor added by the working man last employed. If that working man works 12 hours daily, if 12 hours of average labor crystallize themselves in an amount of gold equal to 6 shillings, this additional value of 6 shillings, is the only value labor will have created. This given value, determined by the time of his labor, is the only fund from which both he and the capitalist have to draw their respective shares or dividends, the only value to be divided into wages and profits. It is evident that this value itself, will not be altered by the variable proportions in which it may be divided amongst the two parties. There will also be nothing changed if, in the place of one working man, you put the whole working population, 12 million working days, for example, instead of one. Since the capitalist and the workman have only to divide this limited value, that is, the value measured by the total labor of the working man, the more one gets, the less the other will get, and vice versa. Whenever a quantity is given, one part of it will increase inversely as the other decreases. If the wages change, profits will change in an opposite direction. If wages fall, profits will rise. And if wages rise, profits will fall. If the working man, on our former supposition, gets 3 shillings, equal to 1/2 of the value he has created, or if his whole working day consists of half of paid and half of unpaid labor, the rate of profit will be 100%, because the capitalist would get 3 shillings. If the working man receives only 2 shillings, or works only 1/3 of the whole day for himself, the capitalist will get 4 shillings, and the rate of profit will be 200%. If the working man receives 4 shillings, and the capitalist will only receive 2, the rate of profit would sink to 50%. But all these variations will not affect the value of the commodity. A general rise of wages would, therefore, result in a fall in the general rate of profit, but not affect values. But although the values of commodities, which must ultimately regulate their market prices, are exclusively determined by the total quantities of labor fixed in them, and not by the division of that quantity into paid and unpaid labor, it by no means follows that the values of the single commodities or lots of commodities produced during 12 hours, for example, will remain constant. The number or mass of commodities produced in a given time of labor or by a given quantity of labor depends upon the productive power of the labor employed, and not upon its extent or length. With 1 degree of productive power of spinning labor, for example, a working day of 12 hours may produce 12 pounds of yarn. With a lesser degree of productive power, only 2 pounds. If then 12 hours average labor were realized in the value of 6 shillings in one case, the 12 pounds of yarn would cost 6 shillings. In the other case, the 2 pounds of yarn would also cost 6 shillings. 1 pound of yarn would therefore cost 6 pence in one case and 3 shillings in the other. The difference of price would result from the difference in the productive powers of labor employed. 1 hour of labor would be realized in 1 pound of yarn with greater productive power, while the smaller productive power, 6 hours of labor, would be realized in 1 pound of yarn. The price of a pound of yarn would, in the one instance, be only 6 pence, although wages were relatively high and the rate of profit low. It would be 3 shillings in the other instance, although the wages were low and the rate of profit high. This would be so because the price of the pound of yarn is regulated by the total amount of labor worked up in it, and not by the proportional division of that amount into paid and unpaid labor. The fact I have mentioned before that high-priced labor may produce cheap and low-priced labor may produce dear commodities loses therefore its paradoxical appearance. It is only the expression of the general law that the value of a commodity is regulated by the quantity of labor worked up in it, and the quantity of labor worked up in it depends altogether upon the productive powers of labor employed, and will therefore vary with every variation in the productivity of labor. Let us now seriously consider the main cases in which a rise of wages is attempted or a reduction of wages is resisted. We have seen that the value of laboring power, or in more popular parlance, the value of labor, is determined by the value of necessaries, or the quantity of labor required to produce them. If then, in a given country, the value of the daily average necessaries of the laborer represented 6 hours of labor, expressed in 3 shillings, the laborer would have to work 6 hours daily to produce an equivalent for this daily maintenance. If the whole working day was 12 hours, the capitalist would pay him the value of his labor by paying him 3 shillings. Half the working day would be unpaid labor. The rate of profit would amount to 100%. But now, suppose that consequent upon a decrease in productivity, more labor should be wanted to produce the same amount of agricultural produce, so that the price of the average daily necessaries should rise from 3 to 4 shillings. In that case, the value of labor would rise by 1/3, or 33.33%. 8 hours of the working day would be required to produce an equivalent for the daily maintenance of the laborer, according to this old standard of living. The surplus labor would therefore sink from 6 hours to 4, and the rate of profit from 100% to 50%. But insisting upon a rise of wages, the laborer would only insist on getting the increased value of his labor, like every other seller of a commodity, who, the costs of his commodities having increased, tries to get its increased value paid. If the wages did not rise, or not sufficiently to rise to compensate for the increased values of necessaries, the price of labor would sink below the value of labor, and the laborer's standard of life would deteriorate. But a change might also take place in the opposite direction. By virtue of the increased productivity of labor, the same amount of the average daily necessaries might sink from 3 to 2 shillings. Only 4 hours out of the working day instead of 6 be wanted to reproduce the equivalent value for the value of the daily necessaries. The working man would now be able to buy with 2 shillings as many necessaries as he did before with 3 shillings. Indeed, the value of labor would have sunk, but diminished value would command the same amount of commodities as before. Then profits would rise from 3 to 4 shillings, and the rate of profit from 100 to 200%. Although the laborer's absolute standard of life would have remained the same, his relative wages, and therewith his relative social position as compared to that of the capitalist, would have been lowered. If the working man should resist that reduction of relative wages, he would only try to get some of the share of the increased productive powers of his own labor, and to maintain his former relative position in the social scale. Thus, after the abolition of the Corn Laws and the flagrant violation of the most solemn pledges given during the anti-Corn Law agitation, the English factory lords generally reduced wages by 10%. The resistance of the workmen was at first baffled, but consequent upon circumstances I cannot enter into now, the 10% lost were afterwards regained. The values of necessaries, and consequently the value of labor, might remain the same, but a change might occur in their money prices, consequent upon a previous change in the value of money. By the discovery of more fertile mines and so forth, 2 ounces of gold might, for example, cost no more labor to produce than 1 ounce did before. The value of gold would then be depreciated by 1/2 or 50%. As the values of all other commodities would then be expressed in twice their former money prices, so the same with the value of labor. 12 hours of labor, formerly expressed in 6 shillings, would now be expressed in 12 shillings. If the working man's wages should remain 3 shillings instead of rising to 6 shillings, the money price of his labor would only be equal to half the value of his labor, and his standard of life would fearfully deteriorate. This would also happen in a greater or lesser degrees if his wages should rise, but not proportionately to the fall in the value of gold. In such a case, nothing would have been changed, either the productive powers of labor or the supply and demand, or in values. Nothing would have changed except the money names of those values. To say that in such a case the workman ought not to insist on a proportionate rise of wages is to say that he must be content to be paid with names instead of with things. All past history proves that whenever such a depreciation of money occurs, the capitalists are on alert to seize the opportunity for defrauding the workmen. A very large school of political economists assert that, consequent upon the new discoveries of gold lands, the better working of silver mines, and the cheaper supply of quicksilver, the value of precious metals has again depreciated. This would explain the general and simultaneous attempts on the continent for a rise of wages. We have until now supposed that the working day has given limits. The working day, however, has by itself no constant limits. It is the constant tendency of capital to stretch it to its utmost physically possible length, because the same degree of surplus labor, and consequently the profit resulting therefrom, will be increased. The more capital succeeds in prolonging the working day, the greater amount of other people's labor it will appropriate. During the 17th and even the first 2/3 of the 18th century, a 10 hours working day was the normal working day all over England. During the anti-Jacobin War, which was in fact a war waged by the British barons against the British working masses, capital celebrated its bacchanalia, a prolonged working day from 10 to 12, 14, even 18 hours. Malthus, by no means a man whom you would suspect of maudlin sentimentalism, declared in a pamphlet published about 1815 that if this sort of thing was to go on, the life of the nation would be attacked at its very source. A few years before, the general introduction of newly invented machinery, about 1765, a pamphlet appeared in England under the title An Essay on Trade. The anonymous author, an avowed enemy of the working classes, declaims on the necessity for expanding the limits of the working day. Amongst other means to this end, he proposes working houses, in which he says ought to be houses of terror. And what is the length of the working he prescribes for these houses of terror? 12 hours. The very same time which in 1832 was declared by capitalists, political economists, and ministers to be not only the existing but the necessary time of labor for a child under 12 labor power, and he must do so under the present system. The working man makes over to the capitalist the consumption of that power, but within certain rational limits. He sells his laboring power in order to maintain it, apart from its natural wear and tear, but not to destroy it. In selling his labor power at its daily or weekly value, it is understood that in one day or 1 week, that laboring power shall not be submitted to 2 days or 2 weeks of waste or wear and tear. Take a machine worth £1,000. If it is used up in 10 years, it will add to the value of commodities in whose production it assists £100 yearly. If it is used up in 5 years, it will add £200 yearly, or the value of its annual wear and tear is in inverse ratio to the quickness with which it is consumed. But this distinguishes the working man from the machine. Machinery does not wear out exactly in the same ratio in which it is used. Man, on the contrary, decays in a greater ratio than would be visible from the mere numerical addition of work. In their attempts at reducing the working day to its former rational dimensions, or where they cannot enforce a legal fixation or normal working day, at checking overwork by a rise of wages, a rise in the proportion to the surplus time exacted, but in greater proportion, the working men fulfill only a duty to themselves and their race. They only set limits to the tyrannical usurpations of capital. Time is the room of human development. A man who has no free time to dispose of, whose whole lifetime, apart from the mere physical interruptions by sleep, meals, and so forth, is absorbed by his labor for the capitalist, is less than a beast of burden. He is a mere machine for producing foreign wealth, broken in body and brutalized in mind. Yet the whole history of modern industry shows that capital, if not checked, will recklessly and ruthlessly work to cast down the whole working class to this utmost state of degradation. In prolonging the working day, the capitalist may pay higher wages and still lower the value of labor, if the rise of wages does not correspond to the greater amount of labor extracted, and the quicker the decay of the laboring power thus caused. This may be done in another way. Your middle-class statisticians will tell you, for instance, that the average wages of factory families in Lancashire has risen. They forget that instead of the labor of the man, the head of the family, his wife and perhaps 3 or 4 children are now thrown under the juggernaut wheels of capital, and that the rise of the aggregate wages does not correspond to the aggregate surplus value extracted from the family. Even with given limits of the working day, such as they now exist in all branches of industry subjected to the factory laws, a rise of wages may become necessary, if only to keep up with the old standard value of labor. By increasing the intensity of labor, a man may be made to expend as much vital force in 1 hour as he formerly did in 2. This has, to a certain degree, been effected in trades placed under the Factory Acts by the acceleration of machinery and the greater number of working machines which a single individual has now to superintend. If the increase in the intensity of labor or the mass of labor spent in an hour keeps some fair proportion to the decrease in the extent of the working day, the working man will still be the winner. If this limit is overshot, he loses in one form what he has gained in the other. And 10 hours of labor may then become as ruinous as 12 hours were before. In checking this tendency of capital, by struggling for a rise of wages corresponding to the rising intensity of labor, the working man only resists the depreciation of his labor and the deterioration of his race. All of you know that from reasons I have now to explain, capitalistic production moves through certain periodical cycles. It moves through a state of quiescence, growing animation, prosperity, overtrade, crisis, and stagnation. The market prices of commodities and the market rates of profit follow these phases, now sinking below their averages, now rising above them. Considering the whole cycle, you will find that one deviation of the market price being compensated by the other, and that taking the average of the cycle, the market prices of commodities are regulated by their values. Well, during the phases of sinking market prices and phases of crisis and stagnation, the working man, if not thrown out of employment altogether, is sure to have his wages lowered. Not to be defrauded, he must, even with such a fall in market prices, debate with the capitalist in what proportional degree a fall of wages has become necessary. If, during the phases of prosperity, when extra profits are made, he did not battle for a rise of wages, he would, taking the average of one industrial cycle, not even receive his average wages or the value of his labor. It is the utmost height of folly to demand that while his wages are necessarily affected by adverse phases of the cycle, he should exclude himself from compensation during the prosperous phases of the cycle. Generally, the values of all commodities are only realized by the compensation of the continuously changing market prices, springing from the continuous fluctuations of supply and demand. On the basis of the present system, labor is only a commodity like the others. It must, therefore, pass through the same fluctuations to fetch an average price corresponding to its value. it would be absurd to treat it on the one hand as a commodity, and to want, on the other hand, to exempt it from the laws which regulate the prices of commodities. The slave receives a permanent and fixed amount of maintenance. The wage laborer does not. He must try to get a rise of wages in one instance, if only to compensate for a fall of wages in the other. If he resigned himself to accept the will, the dictates of the capitalist as a permanent economical law, he would share in all the miseries of the slave without the security of the slave. In all cases, I have considered, and they form 99 out of 100, you have seen that a struggle for a rise of wages follows only in the track of previous changes, and it is the necessary offspring of previous changes in the amount of production, the productive powers of labor, the value of labor, the value of money, the extent or intensity of labor extracted, the fluctuation of market prices, dependent upon the fluctuations of demand and supply, and consistent with the different phases of the industrial cycle. In one word, as reactions of labor against the previous action of capital. By treating the struggle for a rise of wages independently of all these circumstances, by looking only upon the change of wages and overlooking all other changes from which they emanate, you proceed from a false premise in order to arrive at false conclusions. Having shown that the periodical resistance on the part of working men against a reduction of wages and their periodical attempts at getting a rise of wages are inseparable from the wage system and dictated by the very fact of labor being assimilated into commodities, and therefore subject to the laws regulating the general movement of prices, having furthermore shown that a general rise of wages would result in a fall in the rate of profit, but not affect the average prices of commodities or their values, the question now ultimately arises: how far in this incessant struggle between capital and labor the latter is likely to prove successful? I might answer by a generalization and say that, as with all other commodities, so with labor, its market price will, in the long run, adapt itself to its value. That therefore, despite all the ups and downs, and do what he may, the working man will on average only receive the value of his labor, which resolves into the value of his laboring power, which is determined by the value of the necessaries required for its maintenance and reproduction, which value of necessaries finally is regulated by the quantity of labor required to produce them. But there are some peculiar features which distinguish the value of laboring power or the value of labor from the values of all other commodities. The value of laboring power is formed by two elements, the one merely physical, the other historical or social. Its ultimate limit is determined by the physical element, that is to say, to maintain and reproduce itself, to perpetuate its physical existence. The working class must receive the necessaries absolutely indispensable for living and multiplying. The value of those indispensable necessaries forms, therefore, the ultimate limit of the value of labor power. On the other hand, the length of the working day is also limited by ultimate, although very elastic boundaries. Its ultimate limit is given by the physical force of the laboring man. If the daily exhaustion of his vital forces exceeds a certain degree, it cannot be exerted anew day by day. However, as I said, this limit is very elastic. A quick succession of unhealthy and short-lived generations will keep the labor market as well supplied as a series of vigorous, long-lived generations. Besides this mere physical element, the value of labor is in every country determined by a traditional standard of life. It is not mere physical life, but it is the satisfaction of certain wants springing from the social conditions in which people are placed and reared up. The English standard of life may be reduced to the Irish standard, the standard of life of the German peasant to that of the Livonian peasant. The important part which historical tradition and social habitude play in this respect you may learn from Mr. Thornton's work on overpopulation, where he shows that the average wages in different agricultural districts in England still nowadays differ more or less according to the more or less favorable circumstances under which the districts have emerged from the state of serfdom. This historical or social limit entering into the value of labor may be expanded or contracted, or altogether extinguished, so that nothing remains but the physical limit. During the time of the anti-Jacobin War, undertaken as the incorrigible tax-eater and sinecurist old George Rose used to say, to save the comforts of our holy religion from the inroads of the French infidels, the honest English farmers, so tenderly handled in a former chapter of ours, depressed the wages of the agricultural laborers even below that mere physical minimum, but made up by the poor laws the remainder necessary for the physical perpetuation of the race. This was a glorious way to convert the wages laborer into a slave, and Shakespeare's proud yeoman into a pauper. By comparing the standard wages or values of labor in different countries, and by comparing them in different historical epochs of the same country, you will find that the value of labor itself is not a fixed, but a variable magnitude, even supposing the values of all other commodities to remain constant. A similar comparison would prove that not only the market rates of profit change, but its average rates. But as to profits, there exists no law which determines their minimum. We cannot say what is the ultimate limit of their decrease. And why cannot we fix that limit? Because although we can fix the minimum of wages, we cannot fix their maximum. We can only say that the limits of the working day being given, the maximum profit corresponds to the physical minimum of wages, and that wages being given, the maximum of profit corresponds to such a prolongation of the working day as is compatible with the physical forces of the laborer. The maximum of profit is therefore limited by the physical minimum of wages and the physical maximum of the working day. It is evident that between the two limits, of the maximum rate of profit, an immense scale of variations is possible. The fixation of its actual degree is only settled by the continuous struggle between capital and labor. The capitalists constantly tending to reduce wages to their physical minimum and to extend the working day to its physical maximum, while the working man constantly presses in the opposite direction. The matter resolves itself into a question of the respective powers of the combatation of the working day in England, as in all other countries. It has never been settled except by legislative interference. Without the working men's continuous pressure from without, that interference would never have taken place. But at all events, the result was not to be attained by private settlement between working men and the capitalists. This very necessity of general political action affords the proof that in its merely economical action, capital is on the stronger side. As to the limits of the value of labor, its actual settlement always depends upon supply and demand. I mean, the demand for labor on the part of capital and the supply of labor by the working men. In colonial countries, the law of supply and demand favors the working man. Hence, the relatively high standard of wages in the United States. Capital may there try its utmost. It cannot prevent the labor market from being continuously emptied by the continuous conversion of wages laborers into independent, self-sustaining peasants. The position of a wages laborer is, for a large part of the American people, but a probational state, which they are sure to leave within a longer or shorter term. To mend this colonial state of things, the paternal British government accepted for some time what is called the modern colonization theory, which consists in putting an artificial high price on colonial land in order to prevent too quick conversion of the wages laborer into the independent peasant. But let us now come to old civilized countries in which capital domineers over the whole process of production. Take, for example, the rise of England, in England, of agricultural wages from 1849 to 1859. What was its consequence? The farmers could not, as our friend Weston would have advised them, raise the value of wheat, nor even its market prices. They had, on the contrary, to submit to their fall. But during these 11 years, they introduced machinery of all sorts, adopted more scientific methods, converted a part of the arable land into pasture, increased the size of the farms, and with the scale of production, and by these other processes, diminishing the demand for labor by increasing its productive power, and made agricultural population relatively redundant. This is the general method in which a reaction, quicker or slower, of capital against a rise of wages takes place in old settled countries. Ricardo has justly remarked that machinery is in constant competition with labor and can often be only introduced when the price of labor has reached a certain height. but the appliance of machinery is but one of many methods for increasing the productive powers of labor. The very same development which makes common labor relatively redundant simplifies, on the other hand, skilled labor and thus depreciates it. The same law applies in another form. With the development of the productive powers of labor, the accumulation of capital will be accelerated, even despite a relatively high rate of wages. Hence, one might infer, as Adam Smith, in whose days modern industry was still in its infancy, did infer, that the accelerated accumulation of capital must turn the balance in favor of the working man by securing a growing demand for his labor. From the same standpoint, many contemporary writers have wondered that English capital, having grown in the last 20 years so much quicker than the English population, wages should not have been more enhanced. But simultaneously with the progress of accumulation, there takes place a progressive change in the composition of capital. That part of the aggregate capital which consists of fixed capital, machinery, raw materials, means of production, in all possible forms, progressively increases as compared with the other part of capital, which is laid out in wages or in the purchase of labor. This law has been stated more or less accurately by Mr. Barton, Ricardo, Sismondi, Professor Richard Jones, Professor Ramsey, Cherbulier, and others. If the proportion of these two elements of capital was originally 1-to-1, it will, in the progress of industry, become 5-to-1, and so forth. If a total capital of 600, 300 is laid out in instruments, raw materials, and so forth, and 300 in wages, the total capital wants only to be doubled to create a demand for 600 working men instead of 300. But if a capital of 600, 500 is laid out in machinery, materials, and so forth, and only 100 in wages, the same capital must increase from 600 to 3,600 in order to create a demand for 600 workmen instead of 300. In the progress of industry, the demand for labor keeps, therefore, no pace with the accumulation of capital. It will still increase, but the increase in a constantly diminishing ratio as compared with the increase of capital. These few hints will suffice to show that the development of modern industry must progressively turn the scale in favor of the capitalist against the working man, and that consequently the general tendency of capitalistic production is not to raise but to sink the average level of wages, or to push the value of labor more or less to its minimum limit. Such being the tendency of things in this system, is this saying that the working class ought to renounce their resistance against the encroachments of capital and abandon their attempts at making the best of occasional chances for their temporary improvement? If they did, they would be degraded to one level mass of broken wretches beyond salvation. I think I have shown that their struggles for the standard of wages are incidents inseparable from the whole wages system. that in 99 cases out of 100, their efforts at raising wages are only efforts at maintaining the given value of labor, and the necessity of debating their price with the capitalist is inherent to their condition of having to sell themselves as commodities. By cowardly giving way in their everyday struggle with capital, they would certainly disqualify themselves for the initiation of any larger movement. At the same time, and quite apart from the general servitude involved in the wages system, the working class ought not to exaggerate to themselves the ultimate working of these everyday struggles. They ought not to forget that they are fighting with effects, but not with the causes of those effects, that they are retarding the downward movement, but not changing its direction, that they are applying palliatives, not curing the malady. They ought therefore not to be exclusively absorbed in these unavoidable guerrilla fights, incessantly springing up from the never-ceasing encroachments of capital or of changes in the market. They ought to understand that with all the miseries it imposes on them, the present system simultaneously engenders the material conditions and social forms necessary for an economical reconstruction of society. Instead of the conservative motto, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, they ought to inscribe on their banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wages system. After this long and I fear tedious exposition, which I was obliged to enter to do some justice to the subject matter, I shall conclude by proposing the following resolutions. Firstly, a general rise in the rate of wages would result in a fall in the general rate of profit, but broadly speaking, not affect the prices of commodities. Secondly, the general tendency of capitalist production is not to raise, but to sink the average standard of wages. Thirdly, trade unions work well as centers of resistance against the encroachments of capital. They fail partially from an injudicious use of their power. They fail generally from limiting themselves to a guerrilla war against the effects of the existing system, instead of simultaneously trying to change it, instead of using their organized forces as a lever for the final emancipation of the working class. That is to say, the ultimate abolition of the wages system.